Hi there, everybody. Here we are at the second of our recordings dealing with the New Deal topic. There are 3 total recordings for this topic, and so make sure that you're checking out all 3 of them, and also make sure you're looking at the full PowerPoints on Blackboard so that you're getting all of the content and all of the material regarding the topic. So when we left off in the previous session, we were introducing the New Deal, talking about Franklin Roosevelt's sort of arrival into the presidency, some of his kind of ideological foundations, some of the sort of approaches that he has to government and that kind of thing. So in this particular section, we're going to deal more with specifics about individual pieces of legislation and how they fit into the New Deal and what their goals were and sort of the outcomes of some of those. So make sure you let me know if you've got any questions. I understand that some of these things can have very similar sounding names, especially if you're talking about some of the abbreviations for them. So please make extra sure that you know what each one of these things is, because if and when they appear on an exam, you know, I want you to be able to answer the actual thing and not get them confused with something else. So there's some websites out there that are pretty good with listing just, you know, the abbreviation, the name of it, when it happened, and then sort of a brief sentence or 2 description about what it was. So I think I've included some of those links on the full PowerPoints on Blackboard, so make sure that you're checking that out too. So without any further ado, we'll get into the next material. So Roosevelt is pushing a lot of legislation through Congress in the first 100 days or so after his inauguration. And these different pieces of legislation are targeting lots of different areas of the economy. Some of it is agricultural subsidies, some of it is stock market regulation, some of it is the Banking Act, public works programs, all kinds of different things. One of the biggest, and certainly one of the most complex that comes out of the New Deal, is what's called the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this is a huge, huge piece of legislation. Thousands of pages of text go into the actual law itself. It is passed in June 1933, and part of the National Industrial Recovery Act is what's known as the National Recovery Administration, right? The NRA. This is obviously completely different from the much more famous National Rifle Association. This is the New Deal program that is designed to try to achieve widespread sort of regulation of the economy. Basically, what it wants to do is establish restrictions on both prices for goods and services, as well as wages. This is a ultimately very problematic kind of piece of legislation, and ultimately, as we will see on the next slide, it gets overturned by the Supreme Court. Basically, what it tries to do is say, if you own a diner, let's say, you can pay your employees between this wage and that wage. So let's say between 35 cents an hour and $1.16 an hour. You are allowed to charge between this amount and that amount for pie, or for hot dogs, or for steak and eggs, right? It is creating these restrictions and these regulations to address virtually every conceivable economic activity in the country. It also includes provisions that have to do with union organization. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act guarantees workers in certain occupations with the right to form unions. So this is really the first time that the national government has provided that protection for organized labor. And it even includes one of the very first big public works programs to happen during the New Deal, the Public Works Administration, which is given more than $3 billion to put people to work doing a number of different public service kinds of things, whether it is, building public buildings like post offices or schools, whether it is putting down roads, all kinds of different things like that. So the National Industrial Recovery Act is taking on a very prickly aspect of the American economy. And it's not going to last terribly long, because in 1934, 1935, there is a case that makes its way to the US Supreme Court that ultimately is going to kill off the National Industrial Recovery Act, and ultimately that will destroy the NRA along with it. This is a court case known as Schecter versus the United States. The Schecter brothers poultry firm was based in Brooklyn, New York. It was a very small little firm, and it was refusing to abide by NRA codes. And so lawyers for the US government bring a case against it and say, you need to do these things, you need to follow these codes. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, well, the Schecter Brothers company does not do business across state lines. And constitutionally speaking, that is the only sort of provision that allows the government to get involved in regulating the economy. And it is in the Constitution, in Article 1, as far as I know, where it says along the lines of Congress has the ability to regulate trade among the states, right? Interstate trade among the states. So as long as a business is doing some kind of commerce across state lines, that business can come under the oversight of laws passed by Congress. Schecter Brothers, in this case, did not. They weren't buying anything from Connecticut or New Jersey or any place else. They weren't selling anything to those places. They were operating entirely within the boundaries of New York State. And because of that, they weren't under the sort of control. I don't want to say control, that sounds worse than it is. They weren't subject to federal economic or commercial laws in the way that the NRA was creating them. And the Supreme Court said, if you can't guarantee that all of the businesses that you are forcing to abide by these codes are doing interstate commerce, you can't maintain this law. So they nullify the NIRA. They say this law does not exist anymore now. And they, in turn, destroy the NRA. They destroy Section 7A of those protections to labor organization. They wipe out the Public Works Administration, all of these different things. And they say, look, there is some precedent here that suggests that Congress is giving too much power to the president, and or that these different pieces of legislation are not constitutional in one way or another, right? That they are going too far beyond what the Constitution allows the government to do, or the creation of the law isn't necessarily specific enough, and it doesn't necessarily fall within the process that the Constitution demands. So Schecter versus the United States is actually one of a few different cases that are announced on the very same day, most of which end up going against Roosevelt and against the New Deal. And that's going to come in to play a little bit later when we talk about Roosevelt's desire to sort of manipulate the way the court operates. So the NIRA and the NRA are both really significant moments in the process of the New Deal, but they don't survive the New Deal. One of the most significant achievements of the New Deal that still is in operation is the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. And the TVA was an enormous attempt at a combination of different things. For one, it's a regional planning initiative. It is an environmental initiative. It is a public works program. It is an economic stimulus package. Really, really impressive kind of achievement. The TVA is basically centered along the Tennessee River Valley, and that stretches all the way from parts of Virginia through North Carolina, parts of Georgia and Alabama, but it's primarily, of course, in Tennessee itself. And what's happening here is the Tennessee River has this nasty habit of flooding and ultimately ruining farmers' crops, rendering businesses unusable, destroying people's homes, and doing this on a fairly regular basis. So the idea is to build dams all along the Tennessee River, and you can see those dams marked in the little red hashes on the map, and use these dams to help regulate the flow of the river and to limit flooding problems. And this means then that businesses will be able to enter into these areas in the floodplain and not anticipate being washed away every year or 2 years or few months. At the same time, these dams are also going to be fitted with hydroelectric generators so that they can produce electricity for a part of the country that had really been bypassed in terms of electric companies providing electrical power there. And this, if you think about it, it actually goes way back to the Progressive era stuff that we talked about a while ago. Things like Tom Johnson and Cleveland Public Power and things like that, where progressives were saying, well, what we really want is for the government to either regulate the distribution of utilities or maybe even get into the game of generating power and providing those utility services themselves, because there are big parts of the country that don't have access to electricity because the private corporations that run the electrical industry don't see a profit benefit in it for them. And so this is a great example of, in this case, the federal government saying there are millions of well, let's say hundreds of thousands of people that live in this part of America that do not have electricity. If we can provide reliable electricity along with protection from flooding, it means that this area can be commercially viable. People can move in there, bring their businesses, bring their retail shops, their manufacturing plants, whatever, and take advantage of natural resources that are there, take advantage of the population for labor, for consumers, and it provides a dramatic spark to the economy and the way of life and the living conditions, standard of living, throughout eastern and central Tennessee and parts of northern Alabama and North Carolina, right, western North Carolina. Really, really impressive undertaking, and it's still, as I said, it is still in operation today. One of the other really massive undertakings of the second New Deal is what's called the Works Progress Administration. And so we talked about the Public Works Administration, the PWA. The WPA is an even bigger version of that. And it's a broader kind of an attempt, right? The WPA, $7 billion worth of expenditures throughout its existence, provides 8.5 million jobs to people. Well, jobs to 8.5 million people. And instead of it just being public building, right, which it is, it builds thousands of post offices and government buildings, courthouses, federal buildings, roads, airports, dams, mental health facilities, all kinds of things. It also gets involved in adult education programs. It gets involved in art subsidies and art sponsorships. It gets involved in all kinds of different areas that in some cases are kind of overlooked in other works programs that tend to focus more on sort of manual labor building projects and things like that. For instance, there's this really important WPA program where college students and researchers are sent out into communities, especially in the South, and they do audio recordings of people who were former slaves. So we have this large archive of recordings from people who are telling their personal stories of having been enslaved during and prior to the Civil War. There are other researchers that are given grants to go out to Native American populations and communities and record Native American languages that today, in some cases, are completely dead, apart from existing on these recordings. So from a historian's perspective, from a researcher's and an intellectual perspective, some really, really great kinds of work being done by the WPA while it lasts. So it really is an attempt to address a number of different areas, not just of employment, but also areas of sort of public advantage, I guess. Probably the most famous of the things that comes out of the New Deal then is Social Security. And Social Security goes into effect in August of 1935. And it is, as you may be aware, a payroll tax. So in other words, part of your weekly or biweekly or monthly income ends up going to the Social Security Administration. It is combined with contributions from your employer. And then once you reach old age, I guess you can say, you're eligible to receive payments from the Social Security Administration that are essentially intended to be sort of supplementary retirement income. The first payments under the Social Security Act go into effect in 1940. Over time, the program is expanded to include more different occupations, expanded to include different kinds of payouts, whether it is disability payments or funeral support or expanded payment in terms of the amount of money that's being given to different individuals, that kind of thing. When it's initially created, though, there are large groups of the workforce that are not included. Lots of occupations that tend to be held by women and tend to be held by minorities were not included in the Social Security system. So in one respect, it is a very discriminatory piece of legislation when it's created. In another respect, this isn't exactly the same as saying, well, when they create Social Security, they intentionally exclude women or they intentionally exclude minorities. What is actually happening is they are intentionally excluding certain occupations that often happen to sort of be filled by members of those certain groups, right? Minority groups or women. And over time, those changes will mean that Social Security is available to more and more different people in the economy. There is also then a significant effort to address the question of organized labor during the New Deal. And when Schecter versus the United States destroys the National Industrial Recovery Act, it takes along with it Section 7A of that law. that up to that point had provided security for labor organizations and guarantees of the rights of workers to organize and that kind of thing. Well, once that act is destroyed, that guarantee evaporates along with it. And so Congress fairly quickly passes what's known as the National Labor Relations Act. It's more commonly referred to in historical circles as the Wagner Act. Basically, it does something very much what Section 7A had done. It says, you know, if you work in the majority of different occupations, you have the right to form a labor union. Management cannot stop you from forming a union. They cannot fire you because you happen to have an affiliation with a union or membership in a union. You can't refuse to negotiate with the representatives of organized labor unions, that kind of thing. These kinds of issues start to be tweaked a little bit over time through the 1940s and even beyond. But this is really the first standalone guarantee of the right of workers to organize into labor unions. Perhaps more significant for the average American worker today, given that labor membership is sort of on a general decline, is what's known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act is actually one of the last major pieces of legislation to come out of the New Deal. It happens in June 1938, but some of its provisions probably affect you more directly on a daily basis. For instance, the Fair Labor Standards Act is the first time that the government establishes a mandatory minimum wage. And it's the first time that the government requires that your pay rate for overtime is higher than your pay rate for your regular hours. It also sort of strengthens some of the restrictions on child labor, which hopefully don't necessarily relate to you directly. But once again, because of the nature of constitutional restrictions and allowances for power, these different pieces of sort of government regulation affect businesses that are engaged in interstate commerce, right? So that is pretty much every business today, given the nature of the American economy. In 1938, there were a lot more businesses that only did business within the boundaries of the state. But today, virtually any company in the United States is going to be subject to this act or its successors, right? It's kind of more recent iterations. So those are some of the different pieces of legislation that really define the New Deal. Certainly they're not the only ones. The full PowerPoints on Blackboard include examples of other things, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, things like that, as well as other attempts at regulation, things like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FDIC, the Glass-Steagall Act, and things along those lines. So make sure that you're checking all of those out, because I don't want you to overlook any of those essential pieces of information. The next and final session that we're going to have will actually talk a little bit about critics of the New Deal, people who are speaking out either against Roosevelt personally or speaking out against his policies or in favor of other policies. And then also talk a little bit about where the New Deal goes, right? Why it, as a particular moment in American political history, why it ends, and what direction the country is going to take then going forward. So please let me know if you've got any questions. Make sure that you are really confident in understanding everything surrounding the NRA, TVA, Schecter, that kind of thing, because those are all really important. And I will see you then next time when we're going to be talking about the sort of remaining years of the New Deal, As I said, then some of the critics that come out either in opposition or in critique of Roosevelt and his plan.